This is just the beginning.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us for another virtual conversation. I'm Kim Hart, coming in live from my home in Falls Church, Virginia. Thank you to our guests who are joining us via live stream on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our Axios website. Today, we are discussing education in a time of crisis, from living room to schoolroom. It'll be 30 minutes with 3 interviews, looking at the opportunities and challenges of remote learning as we prepare to head into the fall semester. Please join us, or please follow along online at Axios events and at Axios on Twitter. For the latest news, please follow our dashboard at axios.com. The first segment, I will be talking with Ted Mitchell, who is president of the American Council on Education. Ted is joining us live now from Los Angeles. Hi, Ted.
Hey, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here with us. So you talk every day, I'm sure, with college presidents across the country, and they have a lot to grapple with, from how to reopen in the fall to be maintaining viability financially, and how to sustain online learning, just to name a few. What are the top priorities that you're hearing from college presidents in your discussions with them?
You know, we do talk to college presidents a lot, and we survey them a lot. So we have a recent survey. The results will come out early next week, but we asked them just that question, Kim. And top of mind for them, not surprisingly, are summer enrollments and fall enrollments and how to plan for a fall whose circumstances are still uncertain.
And a recent survey, well, back in April, which seems like a lifetime ago in some ways now, of 2,000 currently enrolled U.S. college students, it found that nearly 1 in 5 are uncertain, as you mentioned, about their plans for re-enrolling in the fall, or are definitely not going to re-enroll at all. Are you anticipating a pretty broad dip in enrollment in the fall, considering that uncertainty?
Yeah, you know, it's when you look at current college students, there's always attrition especially between freshman and sophomore year. So that's usually around 8 to 10%. So let's add on top of that another 10%. So that's certainly an increase in attrition over what we normally see. On the other hand, let's look at it the other way around. About 80% of students say that they're planning on enrolling in the fall. They're planning on enrolling in the same institution and continuing with their education. So, you know, I think that students get it, families get it. This is an unprecedented moment in all of our histories, whether that's in the economy, in our social life, or in education. And I think people are pretty willing to roll with the punches.
And in rolling with the punches, I know that schools all have very different situations, whether, depending on their size, their community, what the outbreak looks like surrounding them, and for the bulk of their student population. How are they making the decision about whether to reopen in person or to go to an all online situation, or maybe sort of a hybrid combination of the two?
You know, Kim, you started off at the top talking about the range of higher education institutions. And, you know, that's really the truth. There are over 4,000 institutions of higher education in the country, which means that there are 4,000 decision processes that are being made. And individual circumstance will win the day in the end. You know, we see institutions like our friends at the California State University system who've decided that they're going to plan for online. And if they can advance beyond that, they will. Other institutions, Purdue, Notre Dame, have gone the other way. I think both sets of decisions are right. Both sets of decisions depend on the individual circumstance of the campus. And I have deep respect for the leaders of those institutions who are making these tough decisions in challenging times.
Are you concerned about, I've talked to several parents, for instance, who are not quite sold on paying full tuition for an online environment when their kids may be missing out on a much more full, broader college experience. How do you think the college experience is going to change as a result of the remote environment? And what's your message to parents who are concerned about whether it's worth the tuition?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is coming up more and more. I think two things. First of all, colleges and universities are sometimes thought to be staid, slow-moving institutions. But let's take a look in that rearview mirror. Colleges and universities have put hundreds of thousands of courses online in a matter of weeks. That was an amazing achievement. I think what is going to be important is for colleges and universities now to make the turn to providing extraordinary value through that online experience coming up in the fall. Students and families will expect more than just a Zoom class online, and it's up to all of us to provide that value.
What else do you anticipate being provided by colleges to help bolster that value?
Well, as we speak, colleges and universities are engaged in helping their faculty make the most out of online platforms, create opportunities for small group instruction as well as large video instruction. I think that's going to be important. I think that there are many ways that college support services, from career services to mental health services, can be made available online in very, very effective ways. And so I think we will see colleges and universities not only delivering instruction online, but delivering the kinds of supports that college students and their families count on.
And financially, what are you focusing on in terms of the smaller colleges and universities? There's been talk that the larger ones may be able, the ones with large endowments, may be able to weather the storm, have more resources to put towards really robust remote learning technology and resources. What about the smaller ones who may not have that kind of cushion to weather the next year or two?
It's going to be an important moment for a range of institutions, some of whom will need to find good partners to be able to provide the robust online learning that Kim, you and I are talking about now. Other institutions are going to need to be more creative about expanding who they think of as their students. The majority of college students today are not 18 to 22-year-olds, and colleges need to begin to cater more to the lifelong learner, the adult learner, and certainly in this economy, individuals who need to retrain and reskill for the next generation of jobs.
That makes sense. And I wanted to make sure we got to some audience questions. A lot of the questions that we have received from viewers have to deal with equity and ensuring
Yep.
that students from all backgrounds and all sorts of living situations and financial situations are able to benefit from remote learning. This question comes from Montana. What best practices have you found to engage vulnerable student populations in online learning? And are there any success stories that you've seen from your members?
It's a great question, and equity is of primary concern. I think we've seen in a variety of different ways that this pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in America, and that includes in access to education. So it's important that institutions pay close attention to providing the necessary equipment when students don't have it, the necessary connectivity, and as I was saying a moment ago, the necessary supports. Montana State University, to go for a neighborhood example, is doing an extraordinary job in reaching out to its low-income students, its Native American student population, and students with disabilities. So I think locally, for our listener in Montana, our viewer in Montana, I'd check out Montana State. They're doing an extraordinary job.
Thank you, Ted Mitchell. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you again to Cengage, our sponsor for today's event. And I'm now going to turn it over to Jim Vandehei, Axios co-founder and CEO, who caught up with the CEO yesterday.
I'm here now with Michael Hanson, the CEO of Cengage, the sponsor of today's program, making this live event possible. Michael, there's 18 million or more students in higher education in America today. Your company touches at least 10 million of those, yet some viewers might not be familiar with what you do. Explain in simple terms what Cengage is and what you do.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks for having me. What we do is simply we provide the students, the 18 million students that you refer to, with all of their learning materials, print and increasingly digital so that they can successfully complete their course and their education. That's what we do on a global scale, but our largest market is the US higher ed market.
And the big question hanging in this household, where I have a daughter who's headed off to UNC, and probably everybody who's tuning in who knows someone headed off to college, you talk to these people running these institutions all the time. Will there be a fall semester, and what will that fall semester look like based on the conversations that you're having?
Well, first of all, let me commiserate with you, because not only do I have one student going to college next year, I have one that just returned from college in the middle of semester when he needed to change, literally overnight from an on-campus experience to a at-home experience. So I completely sympathize as an individual, as a father of three boys, going through this process. Look, the answer to your question is there will not be one answer. In other words, right now, every institution in the United States, of the 7,000 plus institution, is scrambling to find the right answer for their individual circumstances. One thing we know to be true right now: there will not be any going back to what was before. In other words, there will be a hybrid solution. There will be solutions where people will initially go back on campus, then reserve the right, once there is potentially another outbreak, to revert back to online learning. Or they will start, as California now just announced, they will start with an entire semester online in the fall. So it will run the gamut, and it really depends on the institution. But the really sad part about this is, Jim, is many of these institutions are very ill prepared for that hybrid situation that they're currently facing, and it's a race right now to get prepared.
There's some estimates that 20 to 25% of students might decide to take a pass on the next semester, maybe take a gap year, take a semester off, given the uncertainty. Does that ring true based on the conversations that you're having? And if it does, what does that mean for a lot of these institutions that aren't necessarily hugely profitable, that have pre-existing budget conditions when they have more robust enrollment?
Yeah, Jim, the number rings definitely true based on our conversations and observations. And I would add to this is your daughter and my son are clearly examples, but they are not necessarily anymore the only examples. In other words, you have students who are mothers of two, single moms, that are trying to get an education, attend a course in a community college, and trying to get a degree to get on with life. And for these people, the combination of the uncertainty as to whether they can have an on-campus experience, combined with the excessive cost that they're facing already attending college, will lead them to drop out of that college experience. So what should have been a golden opportunity to retrain and reskill a lot of unemployed that undoubtedly we're going to see in the summer, in the fall, is now turning into a potential disaster. So I think that number that you're quoting is absolutely within the realm of the possible, and we need to act now to prevent this from happening. And it will require not only us as actors in the field, but also the federal government to step in and step up.
I feel like every part of my life, when I look around my house, think about my job, think about what I do for fun, like every part of my life has been upended by technology. Seems a lot different today than it was 10 years ago. But when it comes to education, it doesn't feel like there's been really any innovation in a lot of institutions. You're still sort of learning the same way and having the similar size classrooms and sort of going through the same process. Will this force change, and what changes that it does force will live on regardless of what happens with the virus?
Well, I think you are spot on, Jim. And if anything, if I needed a reminder of that, I got that when my 19-year-old son came home. And, I was within a split second in a similar situation. We were moving 5,000 employees in a span of 24 hours to work from home at Cengage. 5,000 employees, 24 hours. And, with very little exception, it went seamlessly. people were productive. They, got home. We had all the tools. We had all the necessary infrastructure to make it work. Compare that and contrast that to my son. He came home. The experience was completely different. His education essentially grind to a halt. They went to pass-fail. He got a bunch of YouTube videos and a bunch of PowerPoints, and that was it. The professors that he had no way of ascertaining whether he actually understood a concept or not on a remote basis. So your observation is spot on. There has been very little innovation, and it's now coming to haunt us.
One of the points that you made, one of the things that will change, that should have changed a long time ago, is the ability to do some of these classes remote. The idea of sitting in a classroom where there's 500 people is kind of a drag anyways. Why not do it from your dormitory, or allow more people who didn't have access to that class to now have access to the class? The experience won't be any worse, right?
Absolutely, Jim. And I think that the reality is the technology exists. It is not a question of the technology. We have the technology. We have a platform that has, 3 million students every year on it, 3 million plus students on it. And we are allowing these students to actually have the learning experience regardless of where they are currently sitting, whether that is in a dormitory, in a classroom, or at home. So that is absolutely true. The real Achilles heel is the training that is required of the faculty to teach in an online environment. This is different, and the training is required, and we are throwing the maximum amount of resources we can against that training. But there are a large number of faculty that have never done this before that need to be trained pretty much overnight.
And how confident are you that now that you've watched some of these schools wrestle with the new technology, that they can move fast, given that it seems undoubtedly we're going to live in a hybrid future?
Well, I think the answer is some will be able to move fast, and some will fall behind, and some will fall by the wayside. You mentioned this before. Some of these institutions have faced existential crisis before, financial crisis before, and this will certainly exacerbate this. The other thing that you will see is that the super selective institutions will loosen a little bit their criteria as who can get in, so they will fill their seats. But somebody at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, is going to pay the price. So they will see the vast majority of the enrollment declines hit them. So I think we will see this. Unfortunately, we will see that the economically most vulnerable students and most vulnerable parts of the population are going to suffer most. And that should really, really alarm us.
Michael Hanson, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for making this program possible, and good luck helping people navigate their way back to school.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Welcome back. Thanks to Cengage again for making this program possible. I now have the pleasure of speaking with the Honorable Jahana Hayes, the Congresswoman from the 5th District of Connecticut. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you. For those that aren't familiar with your district, tell us a little bit about it, the landmass that it covers, and a little bit about how it's been hit by the virus in terms of illnesses, deaths, and how it's responding.
I cover Connecticut's 5th Congressional District, which is 41 towns from central Connecticut to the New York border. My district borders right on where the original hotspot in New York was. This is a district of a combination of large urban areas and rural farming communities, and we have been disproportionately impacted. The pandemic started in Connecticut down in Fairfield County, but again, we border that county, so very quickly came right up into my county. One of the towns that I represent, Waterbury, was hardest hit with the most number of hospitalizations and deaths as a result of COVID-19. Actually, my husband tested positive. He's a police officer in the city. So this has really hit home for me.
How is your husband's health now? Is he fully recovered?
Yes, my husband is fully recovered. Our family quarantined for 14 days. He actually went back to work today.
You're the most fascinating person to talk to about education at this moment. You were the 2016 Teacher of the Year for the entire country. I saw when Nora O'Donnell announced your name on the CBS Morning News a couple of years ago. You're a first-term congresswoman. You sit on the committee that deals with education law. Like you mentioned earlier, your husband himself had suffered from the virus. When we think about education specifically, the topic that you have some power over with your seat in Congress, one of the big fears, especially when you look at higher education, is 20, 25% of students don't go back to school. Some of these education or facilities that don't have huge bankrolls behind them could fold. What is Congress doing very specifically in the next couple of months to prop up these universities and make sure that the universities that serve some of our more underprivileged students, they survive?
Well, I think Congress directly addressed that in both pieces of legislation we just voted on, the CARES Act and just last week, the HEROES Act, which would ingest $100 billion into direct education stabilization funding. We also are offering money to state and local municipalities. A lot of our public universities rely on grants and resources from the state. So Congress is working really hard to make sure that they have the resources that they need to survive. Also, on this, from the student perspective, halting student loans and making sure that that burden is not an unnecessary burden as people are transitioning back. But I think we have to be very careful because it's not just higher education. I think when people talk about virtual and distance learning, it seems plausible for a college student, but we have kindergartners and first graders who are now expected to learn virtually.
It isn't, when you talk about the virtual learning, I know early on a lot of the coverage of the virus was the virus doesn't discriminate. Anybody can get it. Anybody can die from it. And that's true, but it's also true that it does actually discriminate, that a lot of communities with large populations of African Americans have been hit harder, both with illness and death. And on the other side, if you don't have great technology, if you don't have a super engaged local school that's well funded, it's hard to do remote learning. It's a lot easier when you're at a private school with great technology and a small class size. What can we do specifically about that in the short term to get rid of some of that disparity?
That's a great question. I mean, my district, I represent some of the wealthiest school districts in the country, but also some of the poorest school districts in the country. In the school system where I taught just 3 years ago, it was just reported that 30% of those students have not been engaged at all. And we've been out of school for 2 months, 19,000 students, and 30% of them have not been reached because they don't have technology. They don't have a connected device. I saw where some districts were online within 3 or 4 days and other districts are still struggling to connect. So that I hope that as we talk about this issue and the impact on education, that we don't go back to where we were pre-pandemic, because these are some of the gross inequities that I've been talking about my entire time in Congress. In my first few months there, we passed a $100 billion infrastructure package that would have shored up rural broadband and made sure our schools were connected and that kids had one-on-one devices. We have to make sure that we're moving things like that along, because it is unconscionable now that based on their zip code or where they live or the community that they are a part of, we have probably, I mean, this district, my district is representative of so many districts across the country. And I would say that there are about 30% of kids in these areas who are absent from school, have not been learning, and their academic progress is severely impacted.
Putting aside for a second, like what actually could get done in the next couple of months, having been a teacher and now knowing that this sort of virtual learning is definitely going to be a part of our lives this year and might be a big part of our lives for forever, what are the 2 or 3 things that government could do, should do, even if it couldn't get done right now, that would make the biggest difference for the teachers who are at these schools trying to help these kids, maybe away from the sort of the private schools, talking about the public schools?
Well, that's a great question. I'm happy to talk about that because there are so many people chiming in now as to what is going to happen to the future of education and what should happen. And I want to use my voice and my platform to speak up for all of those, the marginalized groups, our special education population. I worry about them because many of those students who rely on the wraparound support services that they get at school, they're not getting any of those things. Long-term, Congress really has to invest in public education. We have to bring the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act up to the 40% that the federal government promised. We've never been there. These are some structural things that should have been done. Our homeless student population, some of these block grants that go to our schools, we have to make sure that those are in place. Child care services for our early childhood education. These are things Congress has to make an investment in public education. We cannot keep having these Band-Aid fixes. And we also have to support our teachers with professional development, with learning opportunities. We asked these teachers, 3.5 million teachers all over the country, within days to shift to virtual learning. Many of them have never had any professional development. Many of them don't even own an updated device of their own. So we asked them on their own to manage, and they did. We must support them on the other side of this to make sure that they are better prepared moving forward and that they feel supported and not abandoned by their leaders and their legislators.
My sister is a special education teacher in Wisconsin, where there's been lots of cuts at the state level, lots of tension between teachers and the state government there. When you look at the federal budget, how much bigger should it be if you wanted to actually do all the things you just said? Do we need to double it, triple it, quadruple it? Again, putting aside what you could do with divided government right now, what should it be?
First of all, I hope you can appreciate what your sister does and with the little resources that she has. And I recognize that we cannot buy our way out of this pandemic. What I do believe, though, it is not the bottom line of the federal budget. I think we need to allocate money appropriately. Our investments need to align with our values. There are lots of things that we should be supporting all along, programs that we should be stabilizing. I hope that on the other side of this pandemic, we're not just trying to make up for academic hours. Kids are going to be coming off of the most stressful time in their lives. They're going to need mental health services, guidance support services. They're going to need arts and humanities and field trips and all of those things to make school feel safe again. So I don't think I'm asking for the $100 billion, I think is a good start. I think we need to, the CARES Act invested $10 billion in early childhood education. I think that should be $100 billion as well. We have to make an investment. We have not done that in a very long time. And now we have to stop thinking about where we can make cuts and where we can support local school districts.
As we wrap up, you were a teacher, good enough to be named the best one in the country, and you also have children. What's a quick teaching hack that people who are watching can use at home, something that you've learned they could apply?
Oh my goodness. I am right now, my son, I have an 11-year-old who is virtual learning, online learning. He can't figure out the platform. He doesn't know how to print things, read things out. I always found it helpful, to make up songs or to say things outside. Sometimes just the process of repetition is very helpful. But I think if parents think that kids are going to sit down in front of a computer for 6 hours and be completely engaged, that's not what education looks like. When I was in the classroom, I could look at a child and see if I was losing them, and I'd have to switch gears in the moment. You can't do that online. People have different learning styles. Some people are audio learners, visual learners, tactile learners. There's so many things. And in a classroom, a teacher can adjust and see all those things. The CDC just came out with guidance today for reopening schools, and they are so completely unrealistic. Anyone who's ever been in a classroom knows that this list will not work. Education and teaching is about relationships. It is about making kids feel confident and helping them to kind of take a step out when they're really not sure of what they're doing. It's allowing them to make mistakes. And that only happens when you have the support of a teacher alongside of them.
Excellent. Well, Representative Hayes, we appreciate your time. We appreciate all you did as a teacher, and these hacks will be helpful to our viewers at home. So stay safe, stay healthy. I'm glad your husband is doing better.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll wrap with a quick conversation with Kim Hart, who covers sort of everything for us, has been spending a lot of time thinking about education. It's really striking, Kim, when you think about especially the higher education piece of this, where you have Notre Dame, I guess Purdue, some other universities that are now saying, you know what, we're going to change that first semester. It's going to end at Thanksgiving. You wouldn't come back till after that typical January break. You have others that will go their own way. But if there's 20 to 25% fewer students, there's some of these big institutions aren't going to make it.
No, they're not. And it's going to be a pretty big reckoning for higher education, especially some of the smaller institutions, as Ted Mitchell was talking about earlier. And I think there's also going to be a realignment of the expectations for professors and instructors, especially when you look at some of these big research institutions where a lot of the emphasis is on research and getting grants for that research, not necessarily on teaching. But when you're on a Zoom call with 300 students, it's going to be a lot more apparent if the professor is checked out and kind of leaving it up to the teaching assistant or a grad student to do the bulk of the teaching. And so I think that the expectations for professors and instructors is going to change a lot, and they're going to have to step up in the actual instruction and realign those priorities for what it takes to be a tenure track professor at some of these places.
Yeah, and the burden really falls for most of the public institutions, obviously, at the state level. And a lot of these states they're really taking it hard in terms of the economic impact. They're not going to have the type of money that you need to be able to fund schools from K through the end of college. And there's not going to be a massive bailout. Yes, you have some money going from the federal government to the states, but that has to spread and cover anything. So it'll be really interesting to see how these universities adapt. I do think there'll probably be some clever adaptations that work well for students, but I do think there's a large number, even conversations I'm having with family members and friends of people who are going to say, at least for the next year, the hell with it. I don't want to pay 30, 40, 50 grand to send my kid off to school when it might only be for a couple of months, and it might feel like something very cursory as opposed to something very immersive.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that one of the striking takeaways for me from this conversation here today was just the high level of variability that you're going to see across the country. Everyone's college experience is going to be different. And I think even at the K through 12 level, everyone's experience is going to be different depending on the district where you are, on the state where you are, and how much of a cushion they have budget-wise, and how nimble the teachers and the technology staff are able to be. And that's stressful for a parent like you who is sending your daughter off to college for the first time, and also for a parent like me who has much smaller kids. But everyone is looking for some certainty and for some uniformity right now, and we're not going to get that in the fall or for the foreseeable future. And I think to your point about what people are going to get or what their expectations for what they're going to get for their not cheap tuition bills going forward is, it's not just about the classroom. Kids don't go to college just for the classes, just for the lectures, just for the textbooks. A lot of students need the wraparound services, as we heard the Congresswoman talk about. They need the mental health services that are provided. They need the meal plans at the food halls. They need places to live at the dormitories. If those things are not available, it really does change the value proposition and what students and their parents are willing to pay for.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting when the studies come out about how effective some of this remote learning is. I'll say, like, my personal little laboratory here with two kids who go to a great school, have great technology, who've done everything you can do right. I don't feel like it's anywhere near as good. I feel like they're probably, chatting and playing games and doing other stuff when they should be studying. And it just, there's something, it's not just about being around people. I do think that there's something about that engagement, that energy, that sort of forced focus that makes a big, big difference. I think that will be a big mystery to be solved, to see what the end results are of remote learning and how you can change that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one-on-one aspect of education has been lost a lot, and being able to shift and pivot your learning and your teaching skills on a dime when you see whether a child is engaged or not, and the fact that you really can't do that on Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform that you have, or if someone's just looking at a PowerPoint presentation, I think that has limited a lot of students and made them just not interested in continuing to really focus on the studies, even though they're kind of going through the motions.
And have you, as we sort of come to an end here, like, what are you learning? You've been both balancing your job, obviously working with your kids at home. I asked the Congresswoman this. Any hacks that you figured out that have made it any easier or that have been successful that are worth sharing?
Well, actually, I asked my mother this question, who's been a teacher in elementary schools for 40 years and is about to retire this year, actually. And her suggestion, especially for really little kids, my kids are 4 and 6, is to not try to make it a continuous lesson and not just kind of roll through it the way you would with maybe an 11-year-old or a 13-year-old, but you have to kind of trick them into learning and kind of make it more of a game. So learning sight words, doing kind of a bingo game or doing a hide and seek where they can find the words hidden around on flashcards around the house and come back and make it kind of a competition between my two kids. And so I've had to get creative with, even if I spend fewer minutes and fewer hours on the actual lesson, I've been focusing more on, making sure that they're actually engaging, even if they don't really realize that they're learning anything. It's more of a game.
Great. So we basically have to take something that's really hard to do and make it harder. We got to become more creative with a little bit of time you have. It's a good advice. It's more burden on Kim.
Yes, unfortunately, with little kids, you have to get way more creative than we ever thought we could, and it makes us all respect our kindergarten and first grade teachers a lot more.
Awesome. Well, it's always good to chat with you.
You too. Thank you, Jim. And thank you to everyone for joining the conversation today. And hopefully it has made everyone smarter, faster. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Next week, we have 2 events coming up. One on the Small Business Survival Guide, which is on May 27th, and also on the 28th, Nursing Homes on the Front Lines. So join us again next week. You'll be able to sign up on our website. Don't forget to check Axios.com for the latest news. And thank you to Cengage again for making this conversation possible. Have a great Thursday.